So the last time we met was 5 years ago on a wintry day. And that time we were discussing your first book, Not Just a Civil Servant. And now we have another book by you called Encounters with Politicians. Congratulations for that.
Thank you.
And I'll dive straight away into the book. When Prime Minister Modi came to power in 2014, there was a widespread impression that you also write about in your book, that he really tried to shake up the bureaucracy, energize the bureaucracy. There were meetings with secretaries that he was holding at his residence. There was Pragati. He was trying to break the silos. What do you think the Prime Minister was trying to do back then?
You know, he was, to my mind, bringing about a change, and very encouraging change. I had just taken over as School Secretary, and I was pleasantly surprised at the speed, at the conviction, at the drive that he brought in the administration. Because as you are aware, before that, everything had apparently come to a halt in UPA 2 because of scams and indecision. And here was so much action happening, with the Prime Minister taking the lead right from the front. Actually, initially, we were all being driven, and rightly so. And not only that, he was trying to break the silos. You know, one of the biggest problems in governance, at least what I saw during my career, was that each department lived in its own fort, and they wouldn't allow anybody to enter. So he came up with new instruments like setting up group of secretaries, informal group of secretaries, who came up with very useful recommendations, many of which were implemented. And they were both informal, formal interactions, discussions, very open. So a lot of things were happening, and it was a very, very encouraging sign. I was in a very difficult sector. But for this environment, I wouldn't have been able to do anything. So it was absolutely brilliant to begin with.
But you also write, within just a couple of years, this kind of initial burst of energy gave way to some kind of dissatisfaction that the Prime Minister felt, especially with regard to infrastructure ministries. What was that dissatisfaction about, and how did it get expressed?
You know, it got evident in the meetings that were being held. The Prime Minister was very rightly upset about the lack of progress in certain sectors, which included the telecom sector. In his reviews, he spared no words. Actually, he was very harsh on some of the secretaries. And rightly so, I say, because he was expecting a lot more from some of the officers, some of the departments. And it did appear that he was not very satisfied with what was going on. But all said and done, in the first 2.5 years, despite his, dissatisfaction on occasions, he was very encouraging. He was pushing everyone. He was encouraging anyone. So a lot of it was happening. Things start changing after, I think, 2.5, 3 years. And my hunch is what started changing was the point at which it started happening was demonetization. That's my understanding. I may be totally wrong. Because for some reason, I saw change in his functioning, in PMO's indulgence. I don't know why it happened. What do you mean by the
PMO's indulgence?
PMO was indulgent right from the beginning about what was happening. Unlike the previous governments or at least the previous government, where the PMO was not very visible. In this government, the PMO was visible from the beginning.
From day one.
From the beginning, they were very visible. There were meetings. But, they were all, as was the Prime Minister, trying to get things moving. In a situation where things weren't moving. So they were trying to push things, and hence there were many, many meetings at the PMO. They were driving it hard, and it appeared to be fairly positive, as I noted in the beginning, in the 2.5 years as Coal Secretary. As I keep saying that I wouldn't have been able to achieve anything, but for the drive that was coming from all over.
But can you elaborate what changed after demonetization? You say that
first, I think the open communication that existed between the secretaries and the Prime Minister and the PMO, I saw a change in that. And I saw it in evidence in discussions.
Could you not speak up or speak to the Prime Minister?
I'll give you an example. The Prime Minister used to hold quarterly tea sessions with the secretaries. They were wonderful, absolutely. Free for all, everyone spoke. I remember a few months after demonetization, a similar session took place. The Prime Minister stood up and spoke for a short while. And then the Cabinet Secretary spoke. That was the drill. After the Cabinet Secretary spoke, The secretaries gave their suggestions, their views on what was going on. On that particular day, no secretary spoke for almost a minute. There was a silence. Probably the message had gone down. And then the Prime Minister himself had to stand up and ask secretary to speak. And then they spoke. But there was that visible reluctance on the part of secretaries to really speak up. Probably because in some instances where some of the secretaries or senior officers had spoken, I distinctly remember in one of the sessions, not here, but elsewhere, where a secretary who had spoken out of turn, or probably he'd spoken which was not expected of him, he got shifted. I don't know it happened because of that. But the signal was becoming clear that the criticism that was so very acceptable in the first 2-3 years, it was not so acceptable. It was not very visible, but it was apparent.
Yeah. In fact, you write in your book, there's a line that I wanted to read out, that after demonetization, the free communication channels seemed to have frozen suddenly. So
very surprising. I can't put my finger on why did it happen. I'm just conjecturing that probably it was the demonetization.
But do you think the PM became less receptive, or people around him became more guarded to actually have things communicated to him?
Very difficult for me to say what was the real cause, but I mean, on both the fronts, I found that the reception of different ideas became difficult, if not impossible. It became very difficult because there was reluctance on the part of many of my colleagues to speak their mind out. Again, I remember having discussions with some of them outside the room. They tended to agree, but inside they didn't.
What were their informal conversations like? Why were they
For example,
guarded?
I mean, why they were guarded is only they can say, because I can't say why they were guarded. But quite a few of them became very guarded in their expression. I mean, I had this bad habit, I continue to speak even thereafter. But I could discern that some of the agreements that I had with the secretaries outside the room, they kept silent in the room. I don't know why they did. Only they can answer why they did. But there was apparently this environment change which I discerned. Again, as I say, I may be totally wrong, but that's what I discerned after 2-3 years. I think the environment was not as receptive as it was before. And that's what I write in the book.
You also write in your book about an episode with Mr. A.K. Sharma, who, as you in fact say in your book, was one of the closest officers to Prime Minister Modi. And you also write he was not just a joint secretary in the PMO, he was the joint secretary in the PMO. You say that A.K. Sharma, when you were coal secretary, was persuading you to favor an industrialist. And when you did not do that, you were transferred out of the coal ministry. What was this episode about?
I don't think I have named A.K. Sharma in that episode. There is a separate chapter on A.K. Sharma. And I don't name officers when there is a discussion involved. In that particular case,
who was the officer?
They were not one officer. They were the PMO in general, asking me to do something which I thought was wrong. And the PMO included A.K. Sharma. Somehow A.K. Sharma names get singled out somewhere in a report, but that's not true. He was not the only person around. There was this PMO that was putting pressure on me, and almost everyone who spoke to me, they asked me why I wasn't doing something. I explained to them, and not once but twice. I don't know whether I got shifted out as a consequence of that. I would believe that I was shifted out because I was going to the PMO and telling them that there's nothing much to do in coal. When I joined coal ministry, I was spending nights in the office. And in 2 years' time, I had hardly 45-50 minutes of work. That's what I used to tell them, that there's hardly any work. In fact, I had even suggested, why don't you merge coal ministry with mines ministry? Because there's hardly anything to be done here. Everything has been digitized. All systems have been created. The auction process has been streamlined. So all that had been done. So my suggestion to them was, since the Prime Minister was of the belief that there should be a smaller government and more governance, I said, you can wind up this ministry. And maybe a couple of occasions when I spoke to them, they felt that he doesn't feel that way, so they shifted me there. I have nowhere written in my book that I got transferred as a consequence of
you say that you were transferred after this
but,
incident.
I mean, you can conjecture, you can conclude, but I would believe that I felt that coal ministry had done its part. But there was pressure from the PMO to favor a certain industrialist. Can you tell us more about I would rather not name them. I'm not a great believer in naming people here. until I have their comments on record. But it's a fact that in coal ministry, I was under pressure, and I've given details in my book, but I have not named anybody for a simple reason that naming is not appropriate. I don't consider it appropriate to name somebody in this manner until I've taken the comments of those people.
Yeah. Well, also there's, and I think we've briefly spoken about this, in this government there's an impression that there is a degree of centralization in the PMO, that the ministers do not enjoy as much discretion as they did in previous governments. Is this impression founded?
I also had a similar impression. And having worked both in coal and education ministry for 4 years as Secretary Government of India, I did feel that on a number of issues, there was no need to go to the PMO.
Can you give us an example?
For example, when we had the CBSE exam paper leak, I was Secretary School Education. And we had to hold a press conference to clarify that the CBSE was not at fault. And I saw no reason why PMO should be consulted, or even PM should be consulted for that. The minister said, no, we must consult the PMO. And this is one of the many instances where I thought we were unnecessarily troubling the PMO. Probably PMO did expect information on decisions that we were taking. But consulting a for PMO on smaller issues like this did indicate that there was centralization. And I have written that in my book, that this was another extreme. In UPA, every minister was doing things on his own, which they should. They should do things on their own, but keep the PMO informed on critical issues. But here was an instance where almost everyone wanted to tell the PMO. I personally felt that was not needed. Such sort of, the PMO should be kept aware of what is happening, absolutely, on critical issues, and maybe consulted on critical issues. But there's a lot of routine work that happens. Now it's a question of, it's a personal choice, whether you treat something as routine or critical. To me, a CBS exam paper leak where not even 2% of students study in our country, why should I refer to the Prime Minister's office or Prime Minister? But the minister didn't feel very comfortable not consulting the PMO. So we did go over to the PMO. I did feel, interacting with other colleagues also, that they wanted to consult PMO on everything. And there were meetings also at the PMO. They wanted to do everything at that level. So that, I may be totally wrong. That's my personal view. It's not necessary to have so much centralization. I think a lot of discretion needs to be given.
What does that do to policy making? This kind of top-down approach to governance, what does that do? As an officer, what does
it impacts initiative. So you are reluctant to take initiative because everything gets referred there.
Is that something you sensed across?
Yes, I did. I did sense. It impacts governance. In a country like ours, in India, which is so diverse in nature, with so much to be done, it may not be appropriate to concentrate everything at an institutional level. It would be better to allow people to flourish. And, of course, there would be certain area where you got to consult the top man or the top institution. But everyone looking towards PMO, PMO itself will be so burdened, or was so burdened. You look at the appointments that are to be made in public sector undertakings, the director levels. I read a report somewhere, and I know for sure that it takes months for director's appointment to be done. And this is one of the
because they refer to the PMO.
Everything. So if everything gets referred to the PMO, obviously it's not human for even for the PMO to push things. So not only it militates against initiative, it leads to delays in decision making. So a large number of appointments get delayed and they are stuck somewhere. So someone has to look into it. So if you decentralize and clearly determine that this goes to the top, then everyone does his job. But if everything goes there, there is a greater burden on that institution that is taking decisions.
There's also an impression within the bureaucracy that pehle sabko idea hota tha kahan kiska posting hoga, and now nobody seems to know anything. Is that impression true? Something 360-degree evaluation has started. Wanted to come to that,
So it is a good thing. It has been imported from the private sector. Private sector, there is a 360-degree evaluation. There should be evaluation. But we haven't taken the whole whole concept of 360-degree evaluation here. And that is a bit of a problem. Why? Because it has become totally opaque. Now, imagine an officer who's worked for 25 years and become Additional Secretary Government of India. He must have some caliber, some capability to have traveled that distance. Now, you suddenly decide not to empanel him. Maybe he has become worthless or he's not good enough to become that. But won't it be worthwhile to have a chat with that officer, as is done in the private sector, that if you don't promote someone, if you don't want to use someone, you have a discussion with him and at least tell him what's going wrong where. Here, the guys are running here and there, they don't know what has happened. They've just not been empaneled. So this sort of system doesn't help. It leads to demoralization. If you have a chat with them, maybe not everyone will be convinced, but at least there is a communication channel. You are trying to explain to him what's going wrong and you give him an opportunity to improve. But if you don't tell him anything and say, no, it's the 360 degree we didn't find you. But why? And at that senior level, when a guy has put in 25 years, it is not appropriate. From purely human resource point of view, it doesn't work. In private sector, they have 360 degree, but they talk to the gentleman. Look at how the evaluation happens. You know, I'm traveling to Sikkim. I was traveling to Leh somewhere, and I get a call from somebody, a senior or retired officer. Anil, this guy has worked with you. How do you evaluate him on a scale 1 to 10? Is this the way you evaluate an officer who's to be empaneled as additional secretary, joint secretary? You know, in private sector, people sit in a room, have an intensive discussion on that individual, and then have a discussion with that individual before coming to a conclusion. It's not over a phone call. भाई वो कैसा है? अब उस समय मेरा मूड अच्छा है तो मैं कहूँगा अच्छा है. मूड खराब है तो बेकार है. It doesn't work that way. You know, there are examples of officers. I mean, why I say what I say is, there are examples of officers who were not empaneled as Secretary Government of India and became Chief Secretary of the largest state of the country. Now, if he was not competent enough to become Secretary Government of India, how does he become Chief Secretary of State Government? And lo and behold, after his retirement, he becomes an election commissioner. So there is something wrong somewhere. Either selection to the Chief Secretary was wrong or selection to the Secretary was wrong. Someone has to look into it. It is unnecessarily creating or demoralizing the bureaucracy.
And you sense among even now your juniors or the general circles that there is a sense of demoralization? Because
absolutely. Absolutely. Because of this opacity. No, my contention is it's not required. You know, the government was doing so wonderfully well. I mean, at least as secretary, I felt extremely encouraged. I distinctly remember Prime Minister and these secretaries' team appreciated my work as Court Secretary. And not only my work, others' work also. It was so encouraging. But if you dump an officer without telling him why he's being dumped, and then you select him at a position where if he was dumped earlier, why should he be selected here? There is chaos. The officers don't understand why this is happening, why this is not happening. After all, government works through bureaucracy. There's a lot of wrong with the bureaucracy, but there's a lot of right with the bureaucracy. If you don't have officers who feel encouraged, if you have officers who feel despondent, who feel discouraged, I think the ultimate outcome of the government suffers. Hence, it is important to keep things transparent. Transparency doesn't mean you tell the world why he was selected, why he was not selected, but at least have a chat with that officer. What is the harm in having a chat with the officer? There were instances in the past where I see cabinet secretaries speaking to officers, chief secretaries speaking to the officers, trying to explain to them. It may still not work, but that certainly is better than totally keeping your communications off after dumping the officer. It leads to demoralization. It's
been 10 years that this government has been in power at the center, and you have, I think, for about 5 years, 4 years you were there, and the rest of the 6 you've been retired. As both an insider and an observer outside the government, what do you think is the one big shift in the bureaucracy and the relationship between the Prime Minister and the bureaucracy that has taken place, and how the relationship has evolved over the last 10 years?
You know, as I said in the beginning, in the first 3 years, I think the going was great. Enormous amount of communication. To me, that's very critical. And one of the strengths of the current Prime Minister are his communication skills. His ability to get his team moving to work. And that is born out of his ability to communicate with officers. I think there is a problem there. The problem is, that the officers, as I see, and I started seeing even before I retired, that there was some diffidence, there was some distance. That distance wasn't there in the first 2-3 years. You could communicate very freely. And to me, that's a bit of a problem. Because that's the team that's going to perform. It's not merely the PMO that will perform. The secretaries to Government of India will perform. And not only secretaries, the additional secretaries, the joint secretaries, they have to perform. And hence communication becomes very important.
So there's a communication crisis?
I wouldn't call it a crisis, but I think there's a lot that needs to be done. It's not a crisis, there's still communication.
Is that the one big change?
It's one big change. It impacts the confidence of the officers that are working. I can compare the two sets, the first 2-3 years, where we could say anything. After all, I am a great believer that two-way communication is absolutely imperative. Because the decision maker can decide whatever he or she wants to decide. But he deprives himself for a lot of input that will come in if that two-channel communication is not there. I have always believed personally, functioning as secretary, anywhere otherwise, don't deprive yourself of that input. If you do that, if you close that communication, you're depriving yourself a lot of input. And then a disconnect starts.
In fact, you write in your book about this one incident where you were called for a meeting in the PMO. It was a health-related matter, even though you were serving as education secretary. And the PM asked you something, and you said something that he would not have originally agreed with. But towards the end, he came on board with what you were saying.
No, absolutely.
And later, an official from the PMO said, "Yes, sir, aapne kaise bol diya?"
So that's the key. It's not that the PMO does not accept criticism. It's not that the PM does not accept difference of opinion. He does. I have experience on that front. My first meeting with the PM, I had a difference opinion with him. My last meeting with the PM, I had a difference opinion with him. On both those occasions, he agreed with me. On both those occasions. But I have also seen Modi, after I think demonetization in one instance, he gave us solid dressing down to Chairman Railway Board in front of us. Something which he never did before that. Why he did that only he can say. My personal view was that if you are annoyed with somebody, call him alone and give him a dressing down. But if you do it in front of others, you demoralize that person. And that's why these signals were such that if there was some problem, the officers were not forthcoming. And if they're not forthcoming, you are depriving yourself of that. So as the Joint Secretary asked me, PMO asked me, why did you speak, sir, when you knew that he gets annoyed on this issue? I said, I don't need anything from him now, nor after retirement. Now, I would still believe that despite whatever the PM is PM, the officers should speak. But if they aren't speaking, instead of blaming the PM, I blame the officers. A person who's reached the level of Secretary Government of India, why shouldn't he speak his mind out? I'm nobody to comment on a politician. He is what it is. But I do comment on my colleagues.
Do you, sir, think there is an institutional problem here in the way the bureaucracy is designed? Because you know that your job is dependent on the sort of political dispensation in power. So do you also see an error in institution?
No, not at all. Because in a democracy, ultimately the decision has to be of the politician. It is in the recruitment of the officers, it is in the training of the officers, it is in the mentoring of the officers that there's a problem. In my previous book, I've written that. So if you recruit people who have an attitude of delivering things, then you will not have that problem. If you train people in developing that attitude, you will not have that problem. If you mentor people and demonstrate to them that people with positive attitude succeed, then there will not be a problem. In a democracy, you can't say that officers should be independent of politicians, should not be dependent on them in the sense of being posted here and there. Fair enough. I have written in my previous books that transfer is like death for an officer. It is inevitable, so why worry about it? You'll get transferred to some other position. Especially for an IAS officer, every job is critical. So if I am hankering for a job, if I have expectations, then there's a problem with me. Politicians has his own problem. I mean, who am I to comment on politicians? In fact, this entire book, Encounters Politician, is basically to explain to the world at large that politicians may be responsible for what they are, or may be responsible for some of the mess, but they are part of the society. They are as good, bad, and ugly as anybody else in the society. So there's no point in blaming the politicians. The question is whether, as a civil servant, I am doing what I ought to do. So it's very easy for me to pass comment on a politician that this is right, this is wrong. I'm more concerned about the bureaucracy. And to my mind, that can be corrected through a process of an appropriate selection, appropriate training, appropriate mentoring. It can be done. But it's not an institutional problem in the sense that they should not be under the control of the politicians. In a democracy, it has to be that way.
So can you throw some light for our viewers on what Prime Minister Modi's problem with the railways really was? Because you're right that the railways sector had sort of incensed the Prime Minister. And was this connected with the merger of the railway budget?
I have absolutely no idea. And that's why I was flummoxed. That's why I was flummoxed that day. I don't know what had happened. He suddenly got very angry with the chairman of the railway board, who was sweating in December. So I don't know what had happened. I have not much of a clue. As coal secretary, I used to interact with railway ministry, and I got enormous amount of cooperation from them. All the success that has been attributed to me is because of people like people in railway ministry, because they gave us wagons. If wagons were not there, I wouldn't have been able to deliver coal. They gave us wagons. So I personally had, or professionally had, no problem with the railway ministry. I'm sure there must have been some problem. I didn't care to find out. But he was so upset.
Was this before the railway budget was merged with...
After. Railway budget was merged right in the beginning.
There's also been a trend of late. It has kind of become, has increased. We see that officers are not getting retired. There's extension after extension. And we see that in the central government, especially there is the Home Secretary, there's the Cabinet Secretary, and we won't get into individuals. But why do you think this trend has set in, and what does it do to the morale of the bureaucracy, the senior bureaucracy?
First of all, let me talk about the two officers that you have in mind. Outstanding officers, both of them. Gauba, I have seen him work as Chief Secretary Jharkhand. Absolutely brilliant. Second is Ajay Bhalla, who's worked with me as Joint Secretary, one of the finest officers that I've worked with. So individually, they are absolutely brilliant. But let's talk of institution. Institutionally, I personally don't agree with this. It is sending wrong signals. Though these officers are brilliant, it's sending wrong signals on a variety of fronts. Number one, when we talk about providing our guidance, our suggestions, our views freely and frankly, that goes for a bit toss. Because when the officer starts expecting rewards post-retirement, I think the ease with which he should be communicating, and I saw that in the last year of service, I saw many officers not speak up, which surprised me a bit, because probably they were expecting post-retirement certain assignments. So it is not good for bureaucracy in general. It is not good for institution of bureaucracy, because bureaucrat should be able to convey his point of view without fear of favor. And once he starts expecting because he is given rewards, I don't think it's correct. I've written in my previous books that I am not against bureaucrats being given assignments post-retirement, because they've had enormous amount of experience, and that experience should not be wasted. But I'm personally against bureaucrats applying for those jobs and then... formally or informally. And then canvassing for it. I mean, it's a shocker. How can a Secretary Government of India, first of all, apply and then canvass for a job? Meaning thereby then, when he is in profession, since he wants certain rewards post-retirement, he's not doing his job professionally. The government can still pick up officers who retired for tasks. And for that, I have even suggested have an institution like UPSC, which gives a panel so that they are not beholden to a person who is appointed.
But what do you sense is the reason? Is it trusting only a handful of officers, or is it too much focus on delivery that abhi in logon ne sambhala hai itne saal tak? Comfort. You become comfortable with an officer after having understanding him. There is a mutual comfort, and that's the best thing actually. But in the long run, for the institutional purpose, it's not appropriate. An individual may feel comfortable, but institutionally, it doesn't work. Institutionally, it sends absolutely wrong signals. Yeah. We've spoken so much about this government of Narendra Modi. Now I'll go to Manmohan Singh's government, under whom also you served as a joint secretary. Your reading of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, former Prime Minister, was not very charitable, I would say. You say that he was conspicuously absent as a leader. He, on some occasions, came across as virtually helpless and was servile to the high command within the Congress. Why do you say these things?
I don't agree with the last part. I have not written that. He was servile. I have not used the word servile.
It was in the...
have I used word servile?
Yeah.
I don't think he was servile per se. You know, his personality was such that he was not a politician. He was not a politician. An absolutely remarkable economist, a remarkable person, a very considerate person, but not a leader. Because he was not a great communicator. I have often said that for a leader to be a leader, he has to be a very effective communicator. Dr. Manmohan Singh wasn't. Because he was not a politician, because politicians have to be communicative. He is in own style, has his own communication, but not in the style of a leader. So, during UPA 2, which I saw very closely in the Cabinet Secretariat, every Cabinet Secretary, every Cabinet Minister was on his own. And the Prime Minister did not have a clue in a number of cases. So that's another extreme, as if you compare it with what is happening now. I think we'll have to have it somewhere in between. In that government, it was evident that some ministers were running riot. And I use the word helpless because Dr. Manmohan Singh could not do anything to them. When a particular minister had to be removed and he was fully aware that this is happening, he should have put his foot down. I know some people have come back to me and said that was a coalition government. And he was,
he said coalition dharma.
It was a coalition dharma. But Manmohan Singh was Manmohan Singh. I mean, it was impacting his own reputation because no one could doubt his honesty, his integrity, absolutely above board. But what about effectiveness? I don't even know whether he spoke to those cabinet ministers. I mean, not remove them, but at least have a word with them. You don't have to necessarily dump the ministers, but at least convey to them. I don't know whether it was conveyed. My hunch is it wasn't because they were running riot. Some of them were absolutely running riot. And that's why you had these scams coming in. Because anyone who could do whatever he could do, he could get away with it. Someone had to wield a whip. But I don't think anyone was wielding a whip at that point in time.
Was this whole policy paralysis narrative correct? And what was the bureaucracy's mood like at the time when there was one scam after the other coming out? What was the bureaucracy thinking?
There was so much indecision at that point in time. No one decided. In fact, one of the reasons why I was posted as head of the project monitoring group was to fast track projects.
Correct.
Because civil servants had stopped taking decisions. Civil servants had stopped recommending decisions. Decision making had come to a grinding halt. So this was tragic for governance because you can't live in a...
This was even though there was no centralization at that time. There was still people were inhibited to take any initiative.
For different reasons.
For different reasons.
So look at how it happens. In that particular case, since everyone was so apprehensive about action against them if they took a decision, even if it was a bona fide decision, if something went wrong, they would be taken to task.
Correct.
That being the case, no one decided. In the present context, it would be wrong to say there is indecision because decisions do happen. But because of centralization, a number of decisions get delayed. So the context is very different. We have to understand it that way.
You were given charge of the coal ministry at a very sort of tense time. The ministry was beleaguered with scandals and scams, and you write, in fact, that walking into the coal ministry was like walking into a graveyard. What was this mess like? How was it created? Because so many of the people who would have probably been children at that time would be young voters now. So what was this mess like, and how did you clear it up?
The mess was primarily on account of a report submitted by the then CA. And he painted the picture in a manner that everything was in a mess, which I gradually discovered, yes, there were huge problems, but not the mess that he had presented. So consequent to that report, like many other ministries, but more so here, all decision making had come to a grinding halt. It was total lack of trust. Officers were not willing to commit themselves on the files. there were instances where as Secretary to Government of India, when we did coal block auction, I initiated the recommendation of who should be allocated the block as Secretary. Because I couldn't push my joint secretaries, they were reluctant to write on the file. So that again situation is not good, because if you create those apprehensions in the minds of civil servants, then how would they decide? And the blame may not be the right word, but I don't think the then CAG did the right thing by going to town with his report. First of all, he calculated it wrongly. I've said that in the past and I repeat it again. His calculations was awry. And then despite wrong set of calculations, they became right because Supreme Court endorsed them. He went to town with those reports. As a consequence, the media played it up. Consequent to which, the environment was so vitiated that no one wanted to take decisions.
How did you clear this up, the mess?
So first, developing trust with the officers. Second, finding the reason for the chaos in the coal sector. And it was very simple, but simple was that all problems in coal were on account of shortage of coal.
Yeah.
And we were talking of scams, allocation. If we could deal with the shortage of coal, problems will not exist. So I had this habit of going to the depth of a problem, on why of a problem. And this is what I discovered. And then I found that country sits on 300 billion tons of coal and our requirement was not even 1 billion ton per annum. Why are we short of coal? So I went to the depth of the problem, went to the states, had a dialogue with them. The real coal story is not coal block auction. The real coal story is increasing coal production. So from absolute scarcity to begin with, which created mafias and all these problems, we came to a situation in 2016 where we were toying with the idea of exporting coal to Bangladesh. So we improved coal production, primarily taking care of three aspects. Number one, land acquisition. Number two, environmental forest clearance. Number three, evacuation of coal, which is through railway wagons. We could do that. And situation improved from about 25 power plants in critical situation in 2014. We had no power plant in critical situation. So we improved coal production. And when coal production improved, then rest of the problems vanished. No one, in fact, at that point in time, I remember we did the fourth coal block auction. There were hardly any takers. Initially, there was rush. They overbid. But by the fourth time, they could get coal from Coal India.
Yeah. We have spoken about the differences of between Prime Minister Modi and Manmohan Singh. But what is the difference as an officer when you're working under a coalition government and under a majority government? Because right now there is also this narrative that you need a majority government for sort of policy and development to take place. As an officer, how does this work?
It works much better if you have a majority. If for an officer, it's much better if you have majority, because the uncertainties of decisions don't exist. There is some certainty about how the government is moving. In a coalition, that certainty doesn't exist. So to that extent, a majority government certainly would be better for bureaucracy to get things moving.
One of my last questions. As politics we see becomes more polarized across state parties, national level parties and so on, the relationship becomes more fraught. What does that do for a bureaucrat? And I'm talking in the sense of, now we do sense that there are officers, for example, who would privately say that they do not, in the center, who would not want to go and work under a non-BJP ruled state because they feel like they might end up offending this one or that one. We had the case of the West Bengal Chief Secretary, Mamata Banerjee's Chief Secretary, who was literally caught between the state and the center. So what is the dilemma for a bureaucrat in these kind of times?
It is very tough for a civil servant now as compared to the times that I served in the government. Because what I have termed it as a war between the center and the state, which is very unfortunate. Center is going hammer and tongs against states where they are not in power. Some of the state governments have started reacting. Central cabinet minister being arrested and put behind the bars. FIR being lodged against an ED official in Tamil Nadu. This does not augur well for the country as a whole. I think some maturity has to be brought about in this. And that's where we miss a person like Arun Jaitley, who was a great person in getting people together. I mean, I benefited out of it. I get a lot of credit for what I did in coal. A lot of it goes to Mr. Arun Jaitley. He did the talking with the opposition rule states. And this has to be done at a political level. At a bureaucratic level, you can't do much. You suffer, as is the Chief Secretary of West Bengal. I mean, I really feel sad for him. Because as a Chief Secretary, what do you do? You are directly reporting to the Chief Minister. She tells you not to go to the Prime Minister's meeting. I'm sure he would have advised her to go there. But if she doesn't permit you, you can't walk out because you are under the administrative control of the state government. For all India services, it's very critical time. Because if this war continues, then the officers will ultimately suffer. And if officers suffer, governance will suffer. I think someone should have the sagacity to sit down and draw a line somewhere that, okay, we may have differences of opinion, but let's not make it into a war which impacts administration. Look at, as you rightly said, what can an officer do? I mean, if he does A, then he will be punished by or penalized by the other party. If he does something else, this party penalizes you. This is how the governance can't happen this way. So someone will have to sit down and discuss it. There could still be difference of opinion. There were always differences of opinion between state and center. But you can't make it into a war that you are either on my side or the other side. I think every professional bureaucrat would like to do whatever he's tasked to do. But if he's treated as a part of a political party, then there is trouble. There's ultimately governance.
Do you think those lines are kind of getting blurred?
They've already got blurred. They've already got blurred, and that's tragic. Because then you treat civil servant in a particular way. You know, earlier also, prime ministers used to talk directly to the district magistrates. Okay. Now there is a reservation. Now it's sad. Why can't prime minister talk to why? Because it is felt in the state that they are trying to influence civil servants, which is again unfortunate. I think as I keep saying, there will be differences of opinion, but that should not impact the role of a civil servant. He should be allowed to work professionally. And both the political parties and center and state have to appreciate this part. You can't treat them, because if you start treating them, and if bureaucrats also start aligning themselves, then what is left of administration?
Or you look at something like the Delhi government, where the officers are perpetually caught between.
It is a shocker, absolutely. And this can't be sorted out bureaucratically. It has to be done politically. I mean, again, we have to define clearly what politician has to do and what bureaucrat has to do. Sometimes we mix the two. And that's why we aren't able to find solutions. And some sagacious mind has to sit down and discuss with them, what is this going on? I mean, you play your politics, but don't destroy administration. Keep it away from politics.
My last question, sir. When we met 5 years ago, I remember we spoke of the Election Commission, and you spoke of how the integrity of the institution has sort of stayed as it was for several decades. We're entering election season. What do you make of that statement?
I can't say that again. It's very unfortunate, because the general impression about Election Commission, though some of the election commissioners, I've seen them work, outstanding officers. At least one I can vouch for. I don't know about others. Fantastic officers. But what happened to Ashok Lavasa sets a very wrong precedent. Here was a gentleman election commissioner who would have become a chief election commissioner. For some reason, he's pushed out. That sends very wrong signals.
It was an absolute pleasure speaking to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.